when people feel like they need to be right, they're often formulating how to convince the other person rather than really listening. And, you know, talk about empathy. Empathy doesn't come from the place of trying to be right and trying to convince the others.
I have loved hearing a little bit about, I guess, going back to when you were in corporate consulting and deciding to leave. I know that always sounds like this very particular moment in time, which it hardly ever is. I'm sure it was a very spread out process, but I'd love to, hear more about what prompted that move, what sort of things you were seeing either within yourself and others, and how did you decide to, eventually leave and start your journey?
Unfortunately, it was a bit of a, it wasn't quite a push, but it was close to a push in the sense that I really had enough, actually, when I left corporate. And while I was thinking about doing my running my own business for some time, as you said, it was a gradual process, but I didn't feel ready for a number of reasons, family and my daughter not quite, I think she might have been in primary school or, so she was still young and there was a lot to do. And it was just a bit hard to go on full steam ahead with my own business. So that's how I felt. But when it got to the time when I did leave, I was just totally sick of where I was working. I just had enough. And part of it was to do with the work itself. And in fact, at the time I left, that last 12 months, I had 5 managers. And I had these 5 managers telling me 5 different things about what I'm expected to do. And I didn't feel like I was doing my best because it was chopping and changing, and everything I did, because I followed or tried to follow what the previous manager said, was, was discussed as, well, that's not what we want. And so it just felt like a hopeless case. And I just thought, this is not working. And I was also trying to do part-time, but I ended up working full-time hours for part-time pay, and all of these things combined, I just sat down on Mother's Day and I said, I have to go.
Oh, wow.
So that was my decision at the time. So it's unfortunate that I kind of wasn't in a great place when I left. But in hindsight, though, if that hadn't happened, perhaps I wouldn't have gone and done what I've done. So I'm not regretful of that time, because I might have talked myself out of it, or I might have been too risk averse, and so that push may have been needed for me to be where I am. So I can't say I regret it.
Yeah, nothing quite like jumping right into the deep end to
That's it.
learn how to swim. Quite amazing. And when you left, were you doing the quiet leaders or quietly powerful breakfast before, or
no, I wasn't.
Happened
no,
after?
That was a fair bit later, actually. So one of the earlier things I was doing was more about that coaching for leaders using coaching type of work. And I did a major piece of work at National Australia Bank, and that was very successful, and I packaged it up into my own sort of work, and that's how I met you in the first place, doing that coaching work. So so it was more along those lines. The quietly powerful work started to happen, I think it was 2016, so it's coming up to 5 years, not quite yet. And part of it was to do with my internal frustration of feeling like I'm not as good as some of my peers, of facilitators and colleagues who were the entertainers and the gregarious ones that had everybody laughing. And, I wasn't that type, and I was thinking, maybe I'm not as good in this field, and starting to doubt myself. And one day I had a session where I was co-facilitating with a colleague who was my extreme opposite. And he had the whole room in fits of laughter every 5 minutes, and he was up first, and he had the whole room really engaged. And I was thinking, oh my God, I'm going to let them down. I'm going to be really boring, and I'm going to, I'm not going to keep up that energy. And I was starting to have all these doubts. And so when I got up and did my part, I was fine because I'd done this work for so long. It wasn't like it was a bad session. But I had a colleague who was sitting in the room who knew me quite well, and she pulled me aside during the break and said, "What's going on, Megumi? You're not quite yourself today." And I shared with her what was going on in my head, and all these little voices saying, "I'm not good enough. I'm not as good as my colleague," and she just looked me in the eye and said, "Megumi, the fact that the two of you are so different is what's really valuable. Stop comparing yourself and stop putting your style down, because your style is just as valuable." And it just hit me in the face. And it was probably, while I knew that intellectually that was the case, but that was probably the first time it really hit me emotionally and really got it. And I thought, okay, I'm underestimating something here that other people are seeing in me. And so I really went on a bit of a journey of discovering what that is and really starting to own it rather than dismissing it as something that's not very helpful. So that's how it all began. And it took a little while from there to start to think, okay, what is it? And how can I put it together in a way that's useful for others? And it took a while to do the research with all the leaders that I found who I thought to be quietly powerful. But yeah, so that's how it all started. And 2016 is where I thought, okay, I'm ready to share some of it.
Wow, that's incredible. And congratulations on being very close to 5 years.
Yeah, thank you.
Are you going to do something nice to celebrate?
Oh, I hadn't thought about it actually. It's not till I think when did I kick it off? I think it might have been August. So yeah, no, it's a good thought. I must think about something.
Yeah. And I mean, it's already starting to come through in what you're saying, but one, 5 years is a long time, and two, it's not easy work. It takes a lot of courage, I think, given one could argue that the many things in the world tend to or have been designed for a more like extroverted way of being, or it's what we kind of elevate or look to a lot. Do you stay how do you stay on the course? Like, are there particular things that when it gets really tough, like kind of reignite that fire for you, or what helps you kind of stay focused on that North Star of what you're doing?
Yeah. So initially it was really scary. So that was that, talk about courage. And when I to say, come along and come to this breakfast, it was like the scariest thing I've done in my business. I think just going out to an organization to do consulting work's a lot easier, but because it was putting myself and my story out there, so that was pretty scary. But what got me through that part of it firstly was the initial feedback I got was really positive. And I started off as a small experiment, and so I was inviting 15 people at a time, so it wasn't a lot of people, and it kept getting booked out. And there was all these people on the wait list, and I was thinking, oh my God, there's all these people who are interested. And that obviously got me motivated, thinking, okay, there's something in it, so I kept going. So that helped. And the initial stages was really hard because I did all the logistics, all the booking, individuals are calling me saying, is this the right venue? And I didn't have I had no help. So it was just, I totally drowned in the last 3 or 4 months. And then eventually I managed to get an assistant, Kim, and she was a lifesaver. So that was the initial stages. But then other times there has been some tough times where I think, okay, I don't know if the message is hitting the mark, or there were a couple of times where I had some feedback saying, oh, well, you're saying that extroverts are no good, or that sort of backlash or reaction. And you know, I definitely didn't mean that, and I don't think I said that. So that was interesting. But what still keeps me going actually is the program participants. Firstly, where they finish a program, whether it's one-on-one coaching or group programs, finish a program and they share with me what they took away and what they've applied and made a difference in. And it's just so inspiring. You know, they've done things they've never done before, or they've actually asked for a promotion and got it, or you know, it's just incredible to hear these stories. And a lot of times they've had an internal shift, so something about a nagging voice that was holding them back might have reduced its power, and so they've started to do things regardless of some of those voices. And you know, things like, oh, I don't know enough, or I'm not good enough, or those sorts of voices. And it's been really inspiring to hear those stories, so that keeps me going for sure. But the other one that also keeps me going is the sadness I feel when I hear the stories of people who do disempower themselves. So one of the stories I heard very early on in the breakfast, and that's probably what kept me going for this long, despite the ups and downs, is very early on in these breakfasts, there was a mum who told me a story about her children. She had two children, a boy and a girl. The boy was the gregarious one, very popular, very sporty, had lots of friends. And the girl was the quieter one. She had a few friends, not many, and she didn't consider herself as very popular. And she came to her mum and said, "Mum, what's wrong with me, Mum? Why am I not like my brother?" And I just thought that is just so sad for, this would have been a 12, 13-year-old girl. And I had a 12-year-old at the time, so, or maybe 11, or, you know, close by. And I just thought, how sad is it to have a child think that there's something wrong at such a young age just because they're quiet? And I just thought that is just so sad, and it just can't be. I have to fix it is really where I got to. It's like people need to know that they're perfectly wonderful being a quieter person, a quiet child. So that's another one that really keeps me going.
I'm very glad that you did that you got that sort of inspiration and motivation, even though from a sad place. Because as someone who is nearly finished in their coaching with you, I think as you were speaking about the things that keep you motivated, about the people who participate, yes, I know exactly what you're saying very personally. But I underestimated, I guess, maybe in the way that people tend to undervalue themselves, the way that it would be so quick, the coaching to then, you know, considering projects that, or things that I'd wanted to do for years and years in a different light. It was a very short space of time. And that really surprised me, just to see that kind of instant thing. So,
yeah, great. Well, stories like that really inspire me too.
I'd love to hear more about the sort of strengths that you see in quieter people. We've, you know, touched on it here and there, but what are some of those qualities that can sometimes get overlooked, or that are really valuable and make up the richness of our communities and workplaces and families?
So something I've sort of known, but really have gotten clearer on, in terms of what I saw in me in my quieter nature, is when I'm comfortable, when I'm present, I see things that people don't see, or I notice things that other people don't notice, whether it's in a group situation or whether it's ideas being generated. Somehow I have a thought that is a bit different to how other people might see it. And I think from a group perspective or an organisational perspective, if that just stays in somebody's head, what a missed opportunity. So I think that's probably one that I've noticed myself. And often I would stay quiet, and because I think, oh, that's just a silly idea. It's so different to everybody else's idea. So where I've personally had to work on is, well, maybe it is useful. So you have the courage to speak and say something and test it out and do all of those things. So that's been my journey. But I think what I realized is there are so many barriers, internal barriers, to actually making that beneficial. So one is to personally recognize that it is useful, and then secondly, to have that courage to potentially somebody challenging it or disagreeing with me, because that was one thing that was very scary for me, and I still find it quite challenging, but I'm getting much more used to it and getting more comfortable with it. But as I explored myself, there were some things like that that came up. And then once I started to interview the quietly powerful leaders, there were so many attributes and qualities that I think in leadership we need more of. And we're totally underrating them. Where things like listening, you think about how many people say, I wish my manager listened to me more. And it shows up in engagement surveys, it shows up in Glassdoor and places like that, where people complain about how managers and senior leaders don't listen. Or even in the political arena, even right now, the whole Women's March for Respect, there were placards saying, just listen. And so when there's some uncomfortable conversations or when there are issues to be raised where leaders don't listen, it's such a big problem. And so in the bigger context, when leaders don't have some of these quieter qualities or skills even, it is a problem. And so as a leadership and culture professional, I just thought that's just wrong, and we need to highlight some of these qualities and skills that are so important in leadership, which is why I called the book Your Quiet Nature is Your Hidden Leadership Strength. That it's not just about the naturally quieter people who need to access these quieter strengths. It's all leaders, anybody who wants to be in a position that has influence. So that was, so listening would be one of them. There's lots of other things like what I saw in the leaders, like they're, because they don't necessarily need to be the centre of attention, they'll allow others to shine. So it's not just about them. You see so many leaders who are about them and them only. It's about how they are perceived and their reputation and all of that, which is really unhelpful because it basically squashes everybody else around them. And, as organisations, that's a really unproductive place to be. So you want leaders who can allow others to shine, they develop, they at times take the lead because they are the ones with the knowledge and they get heard. And all of these things are so important. And to me, more and more needed in this world where there's more uncertainty and complexity, where one person can never know what to do. So yeah, that's probably some of the strengths that I see. And there's many, many superpowers, I think, that comes with a quieter nature.
I love that. And the visual as well, you just painted of like starting with the individual and how they feel to, how that impacts the workplace to like even, at a political or a societal level, just actually, it's not just one particular area, but it's actually so vital for so many things. What do you think can get in the way of, say, two people being able to kind of actively listen and be present with one another? Like, are there certain obstacles that you tend to notice? Like, is it personality stuff? Is it like societal factors? I mean, it would probably depend so much on the different situations, but yeah.
Yeah, there's always, I think, an external barrier, an internal barrier, and the external barrier, obviously distractions, I think more and more so now with phones and people being busy, so they're constantly thinking about other things, so that makes it difficult to be present. But also the internal barriers, mostly to do with ego, really. When people feel like they need to be right, they're often formulating how to convince the other person rather than really listening. And, you know, talk about empathy. Empathy doesn't come from the place of trying to be right and trying to convince the other. So I think that becomes a real missing as well. And then also, if you're feeling insecure, I think that gets in the way too. So if you feel like you're worried about getting challenged, or you're worried about what other people might think if you say something, then even your listening is affected, I think, because the attention goes to your inner voice as opposed to what's being said by the other person. So I think the presence requires almost like a secure sense of ego and comfort with yourself, which is really what I saw in the Quietly Powerful Leaders. They've got to a place where they're very comfortable with themselves, and you know, they're happy to share their vulnerabilities, their strengths and weaknesses, and so there's less worry about themselves, which is why they can be very present with others.
Yeah, that's great. I'll circle back to this in a moment, because I think that's a really good segue into how you think we're doing with empathy and connection as a society. But I'd love to ask you first, while we're just talking about strengths, like obviously as a coach or as a leader, there's so much you learn from and develop from the coaching process itself. But what do you do in terms of your personal development and growth and continuous learning? Are there certain things that you either work into your daily or weekly routines, or just things that, like, do you have a coach? Love to hear.
Well, on a daily sort of routine, I do meditation every day, which is really important for my sanity, as well as I think I find I'm much more creative and able to respond to situations when I have meditated. So, once in a while, like on the weekends, for example, I might forget to do it, or sleep in and run out of time or something. But if there's like a workshop or a coaching session or something like that, I get up earlier to meditate first, because I know I'm not as sharp if I don't do it. And I've experienced it once or twice. It's like, oh no, don't do that again. I'm just a little bit muddled, and I can't think straight and so on. So that's really important to me. So that's part of my ongoing development, because I do think it's a long-term development, and to me, it's certainly helped me with this, what I talked about before, about getting comfortable with myself and being able to manage some of that inner dialogue. I don't think I could have done that without the meditation. So that's definitely part of my development. More on an external basis, I suppose. I have a number of coach friends, so they do similar things, and sometimes we just catch up as friends, but sometimes they do ask me some really good coaching questions, so that's wonderful. So that helps. But sometimes I have a paid proper coach, but I don't do it all the time. But something that I have consistently done over the last 10 years is I've been doing this training with a teacher from the US who teaches process-oriented psychology. So I don't have a psychology degree, but I've been studying it for 10 years. Probably twice a year or once a year he'll come out and we do these workshops. And last year, obviously, he couldn't come, but we did a virtual session over 5 weeks, and I continue to learn. not just techniques, but also it's a lot of personal development in these sessions as well, because the belief is that you are the instrument to the change. So if we don't look at ourselves and work on our psychology, then we can't help others. So I'm committed. So there's another one coming up in May.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, that was a big theme of the last conversation I had with Dr. Abdul Saad. And, you know, it's not about, no one can ever kind of have their perfect house in order, but, you know, if that kind of inner work process hasn't begun, of like what makes you tick, what lights you up, what's gonna just learning about those kind of different triggers and opportunity points and ways that you can practice self-care, or who to lean on for support. It makes it difficult maybe to to sustain empathy in the long term in a very complex world. So
I guess in that light, empathy for self becomes really important, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And sometimes we are our harshest critics, and
yes.
so being able to manage that is going to be important, because if we're critical of ourselves, I think sometimes that gets projected out to being critical of others as well. I've noticed that in myself, definitely.
Yeah. We've all been there.
Yeah.
Or like, this is such a silly example, but if I'm very hungry, then my ability to empathize in that moment may not be particularly high. It's like, oh, you really need to eat something. And it's like, okay, what's the lesson here? Practice self-care and eat at meals at the proper times. Like, it's that simple, you know. But anyway, silly example. But I guess on that note, I'd be really interested in, I know this is a very big question, but how you feel we are going with empathy as a society. And I really love what you spoke about before, in terms of there's this, for individuals anyway, could be a kind of ego thing that's going on, but also like an insecurity sort of aspect that can go on for people. And I think sometimes it feels like we're seeing the very extremes of those right now at the moment, where there is this, like, it's almost can be encouraged to, come from that place of almost, an aggressiveness, or like righteousness in your views. But then the flip side of that is can observe people almost like retreating into, I'm so afraid of saying the wrong thing. I don't even know how to sort of navigate this climate at the moment, so I'm gonna like go right into the shell. But yeah, I thought that was interesting, and speaks a lot to maybe some of those dynamics that are kind of just happening in all sorts of contexts. But how do you feel we're going?
Yeah, it's interesting you pick up on the, in a way, polarization of reactions to what's going on. So some get aggressive, others withdraw. I also see a bit of a polarization on people who are leaning into empathy, and people who either don't have the time or space to see it, or they reject it almost. So I think if I step back and think about the world in terms of, there's been some really positive change as well, where people are starting to empathise with, movements like Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement, and some white men are really leaning into that, saying we've got to make a change. And I think that's a wonderful demonstration of empathy, because they're never going to experience that, but they're really empathising with people who have experienced pain. So I think that's amazing how we're seeing more of that, and more attention is placed on that, which suggests that more people are wanting to do something. So I think I see some really positive move on that side. And then the polar opposite of, it's too hard, or it's affecting me in a negative way. I'm talking about, for example, white men and white supremacy and things like that, going the other extreme, saying, it's the complete opposite of empathy. It's like, well, what about me? And, it's the phrases like the all lives matter and things like that completely lacks empathy. So I actually see quite a polarization on that front as well. So yeah, it's interesting, I think, at this time where I suppose in some ways it's great to see that there's some real positive shifts happening as well, but it's going to be slow because there's a polar opposite force going on as well. So I think it's like 3 steps forward, 2 steps back kind of approach.
Yeah, that's really interesting. In the last conversation, Abdul he said something around at some point, because this, to and fro is going on, there's going to need to be some kind of, sounds like a very intense term, but some kind of neutralizing force at some point, and that would be driven by, empathy and compassion. And, there's like a theory I have that, quietly powerful people will be a very instrumental part of, what it means to bring people together, and back from the fringes, I guess. Do you, in like a very micro way, see that sort of thing play out with the people you work with or the teams that you work with, in terms of like quietly powerful people's ability to naturally mediate conversations, or I guess like your point right back at the start around seeing things that other people don't, or patterns, or picking up different points of view would be quite important for that, because they can maybe hold the nuance or the grey bits or the middle ground. Is that the sort of thing that you're seeing, or or would you challenge that? I'm very curious.
I wouldn't say all the time, but it just reminded me of one of the participants that came to the Quietly Powerful program, who it was a group program, and he said one of the work that we do in the program is about looking at our different attributes and qualities and seeing where the strengths and weaknesses lie in that quality. And he saw that he was given feedback that he sits on the fence a lot. And he saw that as a weakness, and we said, well, let's look at that as a potential useful side and a strength in that. And I'm just thinking whether that's the piece you're talking about.
Yeah,
somebody
actually.
who can sit on the fence. And we talked through this, and we talked about how by sitting on the fence, he's able to see both sides. He's, okay, he might take a bit of time to really think through that, and maybe time is of essence at times, but the fact that when there is a polarization or extreme views or different views, if he's able to sit and see both sides, then he will be the perfect mediator, because he's not bought into either one or the other, and he stopped the headbutting. So we talked about that actually as that is a strength, and why don't you use that in situations that requires it. So I think that story sort of, or that situation popped into my mind as you said that, about the neutralizer, or the strength of the one who can sit in that middle.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. My mind is buzzing now, because I think, one of the things that draws so many people to you is like the framing around, have you ever been told to be more confident by, like,
yes.
How many times have you heard that? And I have heard that, but also I hear, you're such a fence sitter. Like, why do you sit on the fence? Like, I wonder how many people hear that, and actually what would it look like to unpack that, but also like, is it a reframe? Because yeah, you do think it's a weakness, and then you're like, oh no, I can't sit on the fence. Society tells me I have to, like, you know, take a side. And I mean, to take a stance for empathy, I guess, is taking a side, but I like, or standing for something, but I definitely get what people mean. Can seem like you're sitting on the fence, but is actually a potentially very valuable skill and timely skill. When you were coaching, did you unpack or get a sense of, for the person you're working with, for them to understand different perspectives, what was involved in that for them? Like, what gives them the ability to do that? Like, is there something they're looking at in what a person is saying that you know, is maybe different? So for example, like, is it their ability to ask questions about why someone has a particular view rather than just focusing on that view? Or yeah, did you get any insight into that and their ability?
Yeah, we didn't go into great detail about what the practical side of things, as in the skill, is, but you know, knowing him and how he describes some of the situations he's in, I think definitely that ability to ask questions, but ask questions in a way that isn't charged from the other side, if that makes sense. Because you can see that happen all the time when you see that conflict, or two sides not listening to each other. First of all, they ask questions from a place of not having listened to the other. And that doesn't generate empathy whatsoever. So there's definitely that. But I think also being able to see both sides allows this person to find common ground, and at times find a way to synthesize both ideas rather than you know, keep it separate, and you know, finding the differences, which tends to happen when we're in a polarized view. We focus on the differences rather than where's the similarity. Now, I wonder too, just stepping right back again, about the world and how there's polarization. You know, if we went back to what's common, well, we're all human and we all have humanity and all these things. Perhaps there's something that we're not looking at enough.
Yeah, I think so. Like, even just when we were, chatting about different movements or different demographics of people, it's like, probably, I know I'm probably going to get in so much trouble for saying this, but like, you know, there is more potentially that can bring us together than what sets us apart. As you say, like, there, is always common ground in either values or the kind of future that people want. I think, you know, climate change is a good example. You know, I have friends and family members who, I guess, sit on either side of, if you know, you could call it that, of like, yes, I believe in it, or no, I don't believe in it. And you know, often you'll find these like massive arguments or debates and it's like science and facts and everything is like what gets kind of paraded, like thrown back and forth. And I think that that's, you know, obviously really important to have like a factual discussion. But what's very interesting is, like, I've noticed some of the solutions for sustainability and the environment are actually solutions that both parties would be 110% for, but for different reasons. So, you know, one might have, you know, it's very important from like a climate change environment point of view, whereas like another side is like, I'm not really convinced on that, but I love like decentralizing power and having a community focused solution that, you know, uplifts a local community or a country or regional town and stuff like that. It's like, you know, if we could get to that conversation, you'd probably agree on a whole lot. And yeah, so I think that's a very interesting point you make there. And I guess something that's resonating with me is the word or term that we use sometimes in our coaching around countercultural. And I'd love to, just if you could explain to others listening what kind of you mean when you say to be a quietly powerful person is countercultural, because I think that was really impactful for me to hear.
Okay. So the way that I see countercultural is going against the mainstream, I suppose. So what's the mainstream view or beliefs around what's supposed to be? So I suppose for me, the mainstream view of good leadership still right now is the more masculine, dominant, outgoing, extroverted, outspoken type of leader who appears confident. When you hear situations like leadership assessment centres where people come out of it and do really well if they're a really great speaker or really quite seen as confident in groups and things like that, and people who are a little bit quieter or like to think about things get overlooked. That to me shows that the mainstream view is the more that sort of more confident and outspoken type of people. So yeah, countercultural to me is saying, hang on a minute, that's not all. And I'm not saying that the traditional view of leadership is wrong, because I think there are times when that's really useful, where it's about generating energy, motivating people through the person's energy and things like that. You know, the Tony Robbins of the world, there's an absolute place for that. You know, people love him and there's real energy generated from that, and that's
makes me want to run around the block.
Exactly. Yeah, makes you want to do things you wouldn't normally do, and that's a really great thing too. So I'm not saying that's wrong, just saying it's a limited view. There's more to it.
Yeah.
And so and actually, if you looked properly, there are leaders who don't fit that. So if you think about some of the spiritual leaders, you think about Thich Nhat Hanh. He's the Vietnamese Buddhist monk who is he Vietnamese? Oh, I might have got it wrong. But you know, he's like the quietest, small Buddhist monk, but he has so much impact with his words. It's incredible. And you know, he's seen as the leader, and it's a very different view of a leader. So it's not that they don't exist. It's not given as much attention, I think, is what I'm seeing, and therefore countercultural is really shining a light on things that are less obvious or less believed in. So yeah, so I'm hoping that by shining a light on some of the leaders, not just spiritual leaders, but actual leaders in organisations, hopefully people start to notice them more rather than not seeing it and assuming that certain styles are good for leadership.
Yeah, for sure. It just reminds me of, you know, the story you shared at the start with your colleague who started, you know, facilitating first, and how, your other colleague said it's actually like both the different things that you bring. It's both things, you know, that we need or that bring the value. But, you know, I think where it can get tricky is like what you were saying, maybe when you're quieter or you see like that you kind of present in different ways, it's that it can be viewed in like as a weakness, and that's the part that, you know, is an exciting opportunity to reframe. And that's why you're doing such incredible work. I have one more question. Was there something else you wanted to say?
Oh, it just triggered a thought for me when you said seen as a weakness, and what is seen as strong and what is seen as powerful. I just recently wrote an article, that's why it's top of mind, that we have a certain, and again, I'm being countercultural, we have a certain view of what strength looks like. And it's typically the muscular sort of, dominating that sort of strength and being decisive and action oriented. That's the sort of kind of strength that we have. That's what we believe. But really, when you think about strength, there are other forms of strength where people, for example, show a great deal of vulnerability is a great strength. And we don't see it as a strength. People who, if you think about the Grace Tames and all the other women who've spoken up, very, very vulnerable, very courageous. That is strong, but in a completely different way. Mm. And so that's strong leadership, as opposed to, or not even just leadership. That's somebody who is strong, not just that kind of strength, the brute power, if you like. And so same thing with power. I think powerful doesn't necessarily mean those who dominate and power over. That's one form of strength. But there's also, Brené Brown actually talks about power with, those people who are able to stand their own ground, but and also allow others to step into their power. That's power with. Mm-hmm. That's much more powerful in my view.
I love a Brené quote. So I think it's a perfect time to ask you what gives you hope for the future, what gives you hope for your daughter's future, and what kind of change do you think or would you like to see in the world?
Mm-hmm. I think what gives me hope is that even though it may be slow, there's definitely change in the air. So even things like Jacinda Ardern being seen as an amazing leader, some of the different qualities that we're seeing in leaders and people noticing that, I think is fantastic. The fact that some of these voices of abuse survivors or racism survivors, etc., are not only being heard, but also taken a bit more seriously. Like, we're actually in Australia right now, we're actually pausing and the whole nation is listening to it in a way that we never have. I think that's really positive. Often we sort of hear about these news and go, oh, that's really bad, that's terrible, but nothing really has happened in a substantial way. And so I think as a nation, we're actually being jolted to doing something, which is quite a big difference, I think. So that gives me hope that, yes, okay, it might be slow, but there are some things that are different to what we've seen in the past. And I also wonder too whether COVID has had an impact on the way we think and empathise. And I feel really grateful that we were in Australia and we took the human-centred approach of looking after people's health. And the economy was shot for a while, but the government stepped in, and I thought that was a pretty courageous thing to do in some ways. So I'm very grateful that that's the approach that we took alongside New Zealand and some other countries. So that gives me hope too, that there's a more caring and human-centred approach to living the way we live. So yes, there are lots of other things that are really nasty and and things that aren't working so well. But in terms of some of the shifts, I think we are seeing some positive shifts. And the only other thing too that I would mention is that people, I think, are becoming more and more comfortable and confident to call out things that are wrong. So if you think about all the news that's popped up, not just about the abuse and things, but even corporates and people in power doing the wrong thing, they get called out much more. I think it doesn't get swept under the carpet, whether it's the Rio situation of blowing up heritage sites, or whether it's some financial misuse of finances, or those sorts of things get called out a lot more, I think. So yeah, I think it gives me hope, and I would hope to see that we continue that path, and more people jump on board with your empathy thing as well, so that we really we really connect rather than keep our distance and divide.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. It's been lots of fun.
Yeah, thank you. That's lots of fun and lots of thought-provoking questions.